Welkom iedereen. Welcome everybody. Today our language is English because we have an international guest in this Logeion webinar. My name is Celia Noordegraaf. I'm the ambassador of the Center of Strategic Communication and your moderator for today. We have a very interesting program today about crisis communications. First, we start with a spoken column from Wouter Jong. Wouter Jong is a lecturer at the Leiden University, but also he is the chairman of the community of communication and issues management within Logeion. And he will introduce the topic in his spoken column, which you can find afterwards on the website of Logeion. Well, crisis communication is a particular specialization within the field of communication. And as we all remember from the COVID pandemic, well, a crisis is really a moment that communication can make a difference. And there's much research all over the world, and it is important to share these insights from all over the world and with professionals in practice. Just like we in the Netherlands have the Center of Strategic Communication on strategic communication, in the United States, there is the, and I have to look on my paper because it's quite a word, the Crisis Communication think tank of the University of Georgia. I see Jan nodding. I pronounced it well. Professor Yan Yin, she is a professor of this University of Georgia and co-founder and a director of the Crisis Communication think tank. And that's really a community from scientists and practitioners to share insights and to bring the field further. Our second speaker is Matthew O'Connor. He works at UPS, and where he is responsible for issue management and crisis communication. And he is also a founding member of this crisis communication think tank. And they will share their views together. And after half an hour of the lecture, we will have some discussion together. Now, I won't talk any longer, but first give the floor to Wouter. Wouter, for your spoken column about crisis communication. Wouter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Celia, for the introduction and also for the invitation on behalf of Logeion. The title for my column, it is Crisis Communication, a rather intriguing niche. And crisis communication is a strategic concept related to, well, collecting, sharing information, especially in challenging times. From an academic point of view, it's up to debate when exactly do we talk about a crisis, when is an event, when it can be considered as a crisis. And for example, when you ask an author from public administration, then it all comes down to, well, classic definitions, for example, by Uri Rosenthal, where crisis is a serious threat, very uncertain and a fundamental impact on society. And the main focus, for example, for public administrative academics, it lies with mega crisis, for example, 9/11, devastation of Hurricane Katrina or the COVID pandemic. But when you ask what is a crisis, when you ask it to crisis communication schoolers, we take a rather different approach. And to us, a crisis, well, it can be just any situation that can be regarded as a crisis. So there's not the need for complete disruption. And a crisis mainly means that something goes wrong and, well, it ruins the expectations of your most important stakeholders, your customers. And for example, already when you have to take off some products from the shelves because of a product failure, it is already part of the realm of crisis communication. So not so much the large disruption, but, well, when people perceive something as a crisis, then we are supposed to act upon it. And it comes close to what Timothy Coombs, one of the key authors in our field, also states, like a crisis is a situation that is perceived as an unpredictable event that threatens important expectancies of our stakeholders. and as such can seriously impact an organization's performance and generate negative outcomes. So this implies that it's all about perception, and when people believe an organization is in crisis, we are supposed to act upon it, upon the sentiment. Perception is the key. When current perceptions and expectations are not aligned, well, we as crisis communicators, we should work and communicate to bridge that gap between the expectations on one hand and the perceptions on one hand, or on the other hand. And of course, I do understand that you want to know, okay, but where does this field of crisis communication, where does it come from? And perhaps also, where are we heading to as a crisis communication community? Well, first, where we come from, it originally comes forward from marketing studies. I think the early publications on crisis communication were, well, they date back to the 1990s, when scholars discussed especially, well, the preferred ways to respond to different types of crisis situations with different kind of response strategies, for example, by Coombs and other authors. And it, of course, it all depends on the situation. When you are a victim of a crisis, for example, when someone threatens to poison your products, you are in a completely different situation compared to, for example, Volkswagen after the 2015 Dieselgate, where they themselves deliberately use software to illegally change the test results. And then you're in a crisis as well, but well, you do understand that it might be might require a different kind of response, whether you're a victim or when you are more or less causing the crisis yourself. If you look at what hasn't changed since the early 1990s, well, that's the need to respond fast. And personally, I love a quote by Robert A. Jensen. He's the former CEO of Kenyan Emergency Services, and he once said, well, you cannot control the crisis, but you can control the response. And that's exactly where crisis communication kicks in. That's where we come from. Where we are heading to, well, in terms of theory development, and especially when we bridge the field of the academics and the practitioners, I noticed several different trends. Well, before I wrap up, let me focus on three of them. First, I expect that, as I just explained, you have the field of public administration and the field of crisis communication, more the corporate world, and I expect those will blend more and more. We already know from the aftermath of disasters and terrorist attacks how important it is, for example, for public leaders to speak up, to be visible, and use the right words, well, to support a community in stress, as Barton says, and to help a community to cope with the situation. So that's not only in the aftermath of 9/11, but also more recently during the pandemic. We expect these public leaders to speak up, but use words under these difficult circumstances. So I expect that public leadership blends more and more with crisis communication. And I expect that the tactics will integrate more strongly in the coming years. And we as crisis communicators, we will broaden our scope, broaden it from just the corporate situations, right, where you have these products you work on, to the broader set of crisis. So that's the first one. Second one, I think that we are more aware and put more focus on the voice of the affected and the victims after a crisis. Until recently, crisis communication, the focus was primarily on brands and the brand value, the reputation of an organization or a brand or products or the image of a company or organization. But over the years, we're more aware, or we became more aware of the importance also of finding the right words to support victims and the families to cope with the situation. And victims and the families are especially an important audience, and their part as an important stakeholder group in crisis communication that cannot, and I expect it will not, be neglected in the near future. And then the third one, and that's a trend you already noticed from the US, and that's about social activism. And that's about that employees raise their voices on social issues. For example, in so-called employee resource groups, you notice that within corporations, employees, they already build pressure on management of their organizations to take a stance in current social developments. And compared to previous years, those employees, they don't hesitate to go public. Something you couldn't imagine perhaps 5 to 10 years ago. But for example, Disney personnel asking their board to take a stance in the Florida debate on the Don't Say Gay bill. Under similar circumstances, employees who asked their companies to take a stance and raise their voice in debates such as Black Lives Matter. Well, even though Michael Jordan's famous remark, Republicans buy sneakers too, was intended as a joke at the time, what you see the response shows that corporate communication becomes more and more politicized and part of, well, this social activism. And I think we can confirm this trend already from a Dutch point of view as well. If you just look at the negative and public backlash of the promise by the Heineken beer company when they promised to leave Russia and, well, when they didn't leave at all. That shows that organizations are operating more and more in a social and political context nowadays. And you're not just selling beer anymore, but anything you do and everything you will do, that will be assessed in a much broader scope. So to us, to wrap up, as communication and crisis communication professionals, we should be aware of these developments, act upon them. And I think we are in the position, because of the expertise and the knowledge we have, to anticipate on these future crises. We have the knowledge, the expertise, perhaps even the gut feeling. And I think it's our duty to act as a so-called canary in the coal mine to our boards, to prepare them and warn organizations we work for the new and bumpy road that might lie ahead of us. But to sum up, and well, that's perhaps also why I and others just like this field of communication. And it's an intriguing niche, because you never know what will be ahead around the corner of the road we're onto. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Wouter, for this interesting perspective on crisis communication. It's when we hear you, it's not something extraordinary, but it can happen every day when it is something that is perceived as a crisis and not only something exceptional. Well, it's very interesting. We will go further with our special guest, Jan Yin and Matthew O'Connor. Wouter met them already, I just heard, in Florida on where is an annual conference on crisis communication. There are also contacts between the University of Amsterdam and the University of Georgia. That's why we have this webinar. And we hope to learn from Georgia also in the future, and now and in the future. Jan and Matt, you will present your story. Jan starts with an overview of the crisis communication think tank. You can ask questions in the chat. Between a few, on certain moments, we will give space for asking the questions. And after the complete presentation, there will be enough space for really a discussion. So first their story with some questions in between, and afterwards we will discuss the complete presentation. In the end, about 5 minutes to 5, Christian will take over, our Logeion professor, to make a summary and give the reflection. If you want to give your remarks in the chat, you can do it also in Dutch. I will be a kind of connection between you and the speakers. It doesn't need in English. So I give the floor to Jan.
Well, thank you, Celia, for the fantastic introduction. And also, Walter, thank you for the column, which sets our conversation in a perfect tone. So one of my favorite questions from my students asking me is like, why crisis? My answer is, it's not because we don't like crises, right? However, as communicators, regardless scholar or practitioner, there's something communication can do to enhance the way we handle crises, maybe prepare for crises, and meanwhile, at the end of the day, is to reduce pain and suffering for the organization, for the stakeholders at a human level. right? So it's from that really simple standpoint, we do this together. So I would like to start with a little bit kind of background about who we are. We are Crisis Communication Think Tank at the University of Georgia. We just simply refer to that as CCTT. I know it's a lot of kind of acronym to refer to, but let's get started. So our think tank was founded back in 2018, and we are proud to say that from the very beginning, the Netherlands, University of Amsterdam has been a crucial part of it. And Tony Vandermeer, I saw Tony was in the audience earlier came in, that he's been a founding member as we started putting together a group of scholars and practitioners, primarily in the US. However, we do drafted leading international scholar practitioners as well, right? So we put together a thought leadership entity designed to further discussion and understanding of crisis communication and conflict management, research and practice. So we can really kind of deal with the evolving technology and bridging theory and practice, as Walter alluded to earlier already, via research, training, and collaboration at all levels. So if we look at our structure, we have three key components. The first one, we call that Crisis Communication Coalition. That is our people, our manpower, right? So there's where our Crisis Communication Think Tank members resides in, including Tony, including Matt, and also, of course, your organization and Christian. And Outscore is also part of this coalition while building, expanding into the scholarly and practitioner arenas in the US and globally. And in the middle is we call that intelligence center. So we have a crisis insights and analytics lab. We call that CIA lab, focusing on intelligence. So this is where our research group, led by faculty, students, and advised by our practitioners, to developing theory-driven, evidence-based guidelines for how can we be more effective in responding, in preparing for crises. Last but not least is our Crisis Preparedness and Resilience Hub, a CPR hub, right? So this part is how can we build resilience for organizations, for associations globally? So we provide training, we provide this type of workshop, seminar, webinar, information sharing. So we take what we learn from our think tank, research and practice to a broader arena so we can all co-learn and reinvent ourselves to be more effective and doing our job better. Okay, and then here is some more information about our components and our approach. So we are very proud to say that actually a few days ago, there's an article was published in the Journal of Contingencies and Crisis Management. The chief editor is Timothy Coombs, who is also a founding member of our think tank. So I wrote a short case study about our think tank approach by bringing the best of both worlds into the practice and research of crisis communication. So a quick example, if you see the right hand of our current members, you can see a wide spectrum of practitioners and scholars, and also the organizations that are representing this group. As Walter mentioned earlier in the column, right? So really one of the trends is how do we blend the leadership from different sectors, corporations, agencies, government agencies, nonprofit, university. So here is our attempt and our effort, what we have accomplished so far. You can see we have different universities involved, including University of Amsterdam. We also have on the practitioner side, we have UPS, American Airlines, we have American Medical Association, we have the FDA, right? So reflecting that it's really a joint effort from communication leaders from different sectors to co-tackle those evolving and increasingly challenging crisis issues, mega crisis, and other critical risks that are in front of us globally. And here's who we are. We are real. We actually need and do things together, not just AI-generated images. Okay, so here we are. And a big kind of quick journey summary. So since our foundation in 2018, so our model is that our group will meet once a year, physically in person at the University of Georgia. So we have different themes to guide our yearly discussion. And after we meet the full day, then our members will be working together in different tasks, including writing a book together, including producing webinars and seminars to disseminate information, involving creating e-booklet and online learning modules, right? So give another example. So the sticky crisis is where back in 2019, we proposed this concept called sticky crisis. So what is sticky crisis? It's not just one time, one brand is being threatened by a rumor or a scandal, right? It's the industry, across public and private sectors, we are constantly challenged by issues that is complex, not going away, that the resolution of which needs the coordination of leaders from different sectors. So think of COVID, think about ongoing geopolitical challenges, think about economic recession, right? So all these things, they might not be materialized as one particular crisis yet to one organization. However, sooner or later, that needs to be prepared for, to be managed in order to respond later to reduce the damage. Okay, so that's our 2019 theme. And then in our e-disruptor, of course, that year in 2020, we are disrupted by COVID. So we turn our gathering online to discuss how technology, including AI, including metaverse, how this evolving technology has changed the way we function, has created new emerging crisis risk and potential challenges. So one thing we talk about in that year is that the term disruptor or disruptive by nature, just like conflict, is not always bad, right? Because something disruptive can create a disaster if we are not prepared for that. On the other hand, a good disruptor, like a conflict issue, can bring awareness, might create, might open up opportunities for organizations and entities, governments to learn how to manage the change proactively. So in that theme session in 2020-2021, we discussed these disruptors. How do we manage the technological challenges? And last year, we focused on polarization. What is POP? POP is power of people. So this is where also link back to our column earlier, but it's the power of people, not so much as focusing on how do we respond to a particular crisis, but think about how do we really capitalize on the power of people, internal and external, internally employees, externally our community. So the issue we're tackling last year, focusing on last year was polarization. But we focus on solution is to evoke the power of people to help depolarize, helping our communicators maybe become effective mediator to create solution, to bring people disagreeing, to identify shared value and create meaningful conversation. And hopefully that will contribute to tackling polarization by nature is a type of sticky crisis. Okay, so most recently, it's back a few weeks ago in April, our keyword is keystone. So what is a keystone? Keystone is the centerpiece on construction or in the structure, in the building that holds everything together. So it's time, similarly as Walter mentioned earlier, looking back, looking presently, and looking forward. How have we been doing? Is the architecture of crisis communication and crisis management is working? Is it needs to be improved? If so, how? So in our April full-day program, so we talk about different areas. We can do a really kind of deep dive into what we've been doing, how can we do better, how can we continue tackling those sticky crisis challenges in the organizational, in health, in disaster, and technological arenas. So that, so this is a visual, a physical program that we've been doing in Athens, Georgia on campus. But then this is the first time we're bringing what we learned from our campus, from our day meeting to an international site, as University of Amsterdam is an international partner of our think tank. So in the spirit of sharing our insights to our global partners, we would like to share with you some key takeaways in the four fundamental structures of our day program. So we start with laying the foundation. and moving forward to how can we learn historically, philosophically, how can we conceptualize a new framework together? And then from there, we're diving deeper into the alternate universe, including AI, VR, and metaverse. Last but not least, we start to have a time travel journey into how we contending with intangible, such as time, such as memory. What does that mean for our crisis communication framework building and engaging in more ethical, effective practice in the future? So for the next 4 slides, I'll be going over some key points, and then Matt, our practitioner founding member, is going to join the conversation, sharing with us his perspective and observation and insights further. Okay.
Maybe in between, maybe there will be some questions about your first part. Can you change back to the slide before?
Yeah.
Did I understand well that this is your program for the coming years?
This is the program we completed last April. So yes. Last month, yes. So with our day event happens every April. In the University of Georgia, and then, but however, the theme is going to guide our year-long process and project. So, give you an example. So, in the next few weeks, we're going to announce our key output for the year of 2023 to 2024. So, what we're going to do is there will be a special issue to be hosted by the Journal of Contingencies and Crisis Management. The special issue title will be Keystone. Searching for the crisis management keystone, and also our think tank member will become the primary foundation for the special issue editorial board. So we'll be soliciting globally entry submissions from scholars and practitioners to talk about what's your input in those foundation, new framework, different universe, and the intangibles. So we actually would love to have some submissions from Dutch practitioners and scholars. Can be a traditional research article and can be a practitioner-oriented case study. Yes. So yeah, so our structure is we meet one day every year, every spring, and then that meeting day insights like this is going to be summarized and shared with other scholar practitioner. This will guide our yearly outputs, program development, so we can continue building something we can share and give back to the community of our practitioners.
Okay, well, thank you very much, because I thought it was really interesting, these different themes, and also nice to know that it are almost the same themes also here in the Netherlands. Polarization is really an important theme, the power, activating the power of people. So nice to hear. Go on. There were some questions in the chat, but they were about the presentation. Will that be shared? And we said yes, we will share the presentation. So you can go on.
All right, thank you. Okay, wow. So first, let's look at laying the foundation. So here are the few foundational pieces our think tank members co-identified at our April gathering. So for our first one is that, as we all know, right? So the demand, the expectation of crisis communication response is increased dramatically, right? But that creates challenge of how can we balance, be quick, respond quickly, and with accuracy, for instance. And then we're looking to the ongoing challenge of cancel culture, and the nature of cancel culture is dividing our society, creating challenges, is part of the polarization driver. But meanwhile, where's the solution? Can we find a way to bring people together? So that's one of the questions we have. And also the communication channels, as we all know that the trust level across the board of about government agencies, about traditional news media has been going down according to the Alderman trust barometer, right? So how can we repair that trust? How can we restore trust in somehow, somewhere? And then employee empowerment, employee activism. It's bringing the power of people internally. But meanwhile, organizations are facing, what if my employees disagree? Especially when there's an issue that is so divisive that even among your employees, there are people who are advocating for different stances, setting different expectations for what the CEO, what the leadership should advocate, right? So the pressure, ongoing pressure inside and out, and very often they might be conflicting against each other. How can we manage that type of competition and conflict going beyond just simply responding to a crisis? And then timing. When to respond? Is there a premier timing, premier sequencing of crisis response? Is silence a choice at all? To what degree? And then, of course, we have data security challenges and how do we establish credibility, especially when the trust level has been decaying in the past 5 or 6 years. And then we also argue the importance of really help our practice and research to shift from focus on response, from purely just on preparedness to the sense of readiness. One of our members actually referred to the analogy of being in the military, right? Because when you are in the military, the whole thing is that you're always in this war zone mode. So it's not just like tomorrow you'll be getting the battle. You are constantly getting ready to address the threat, to respond to the challenges. So readiness will likely be another important theme for our think tank to consider, to work on together in the coming years. So I would like to invite Matt, any highlights, any thoughts, insights from your perspective on any of those points and beyond?
Yes, a few and an excellent overview of these. So we have definitely moved from a mindset of issues management to preparedness to a constant state of readiness as much as possible. The faster response and the timing very much go together, especially when you look at the different communications channels that people are using. And so, and Wouter touched on this earlier this morning as well, is just because there is a conversation in different channels, say a Facebook page that is composed of people who are all of the same mindset, if that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to respond. Twitter is an excellent example. I think we've probably all seen plenty of things on Twitter where you look at it and it's like, it's not really something we should comment on because all we'll be doing is feeding it. And if we keep feeding it, it's just going to keep growing, or if we let it go, we'll move on to something else soon. And so that's where the faster response is so important now, along with the understanding the communications channels and what people are saying, because a lot of times you can identify it as something that you don't want to comment on. In other cases, if you see a larger issue coming and you can prepare for it, then you think of your different communications channels. There are so many times where we as practitioners spend time on it to let our leadership know, either communications leadership or broader business leadership, about a certain situation and let them know that it's on our radar. We see it. This is what we're doing. This is why we are doing it. And so that way, from a broader business standpoint, it builds that communication, it builds that trust, it builds that partnership with our peers in legal, in operations, and whichever other area that we need to be working.
Your UPC of UPS, that is a worldwide package. Well, you bring things around the world, so I think there will be a lot of crises all over the world. Is that right? And are there some similarities in crisis worldwide you have to deal with?
There are, yes, there are. In fact, we saw this a great deal. You know, Wouter mentioned the pandemic. And we saw a great deal of that during the pandemic. Just say the same thing with some things on social media. Even today, there are some things that, if you think of a crisis as a different tier, so tier 1, 2, or 3, tier 1 being local, 2 regional, 3 national and international, wherever it starts. And even a tier 1 at a local level, it may not be very important to most people, but to the people who are in that area, to the people it affects, it's still very important to them. And so when you see things that have come through, say, when we were all in the midst of the pandemic, there was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of uncertainty, there was a fair amount of fear. And so how do you respond to the things, to employee concerns, to customer concerns, following the guidelines from whether it was in the US, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or internationally, the World Health Organization. And sometimes those didn't always line up, but you still had to approach it from the same standpoint. The practices were all the same, but we delivered them locally or nationally or internationally, depending on the situation, but the premise is still the same.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, well, let's move forward into our next pillar. So this one is where we're looking to kind of look back and look presently and looking forward of what we've been doing. So what has changed and what has not changed, or what needs to be changed. Okay, so what we come up with is that we need to pay attention to the persistence of the problems despite time passing. Right, so especially, I think a lot of crisis communication practitioner focus on now. Right, let's deal with this crisis, move forward. We recovered. Let's next to the next challenge and project. On the other hand, in our panel discussion at our think tank event, we talk about how can we really remembering what happened in the past, really learn from the practice, from the theory, from the research, so we can build a fundamental shared memory and community moving ahead. We also portioned the challenge of we call that the tyranny of being right. Right, this is one of the challenges, as example, what we noticed during the pandemic communication globally. Right, so let's use public health communication as an example. Right, so during pandemic, as we know, there are a lot of kind of polarization issues and people disagree, and there's a lack of tolerance and a lot of kind of negativity associated with the communication responses. So one of the observation our members share is that, traditionally the way a public health authority talking to stakeholders is that, hey, I'm telling you doing this. If you don't listen, too bad. Or I'm always right, you are wrong, right? So that one way communication approach might not be the best way that aiming towards the best response. So are there other ways we can really engaging with people at risk during crisis, be really effective, let their voice be heard, telling their story, and really doing this kind of co-creational approach instead of one-way preaching, we're always right. We also talk about how we need to find a core center of trust. If our stakeholders don't trust government, don't trust traditional media, don't trust the employers, who do they trust? So where is the center? Is there such a center existing? We also talk about pay attention to secondary crisis as you are managing an ongoing focal crises, and also talk about how do we reconceptualize social media. There are a lot of workshops and trainings about how do we use social media during crisis, right? But we would argue social media is just one of those key channels, but the key thing is not the media technology per se, is the influencer, who is really the opinion leaders. And also we think about, we talk a lot about big data, monitoring, social listening, right? So the challenge is that how do we strike a balance, understanding a ongoing risk, crisis, conflict issue, balancing both the digital, the numbers, and also the qualitative story behind. How to really make sense of those data sets we're receiving from agencies or from our in-house experts. And meantime, be courageous and brave to ask questions, being an advocate of your team, being an advocate of the stakeholders you're representing. So on those notes, I will turn the floor to Matt to seeking his insights, observation as practitioner.
Yeah, so it's it really comes down to just being as transparent as possible. And then also, and something that we're working on as a group is there's a group called Plain Speak. We're speaking plainly, as to resist the urge to write in a corporate tone. Here in the States, there's research that consistently comes back as The news media tend to write for a 5th to 8th grade level, and also when you read something on a smaller screen, so on your phone instead of a laptop, shorter sentences, so you really need to lower the level of the intellect in your messages so that people can quickly read them, understand them, relate to them, and understand in a way that's meaningful. And so that's where, when dealing with a crisis situation, you can't always share everything. But what can you share? And how can you share it in a way that is impactful to those audiences? And when you look at how you convey those messages, that can build and will build trust. And this also bridges into something that the last section we'll talk about is contending with the intangible, which is time and memory. How is the organization, whether it's business or university or a government, how are they remembered over time? And it's built up over time. So how are you engaging with them? Are you empathetic? Are you clear in what you're saying? Do they believe what you're saying because you're talking about it right away and addressing the question or the issue right away, instead of writing a flowery statement and then backing into the question? If you talk with them as you would talk with your neighbor or your spouse or your grandparent or an aunt and uncle, much higher success, as opposed to writing for a fellow practitioner who's very much understanding the corporate speak.
Well, thank you, Matt. Your plea for a plain speak. Well, that sounds great. There's a question, because you speak about transparency, you already named it. You cannot share everything always, but if you share something, then you need to be transparent and use plain speak. This is a kind of paradox, especially when the context is complex. How do you tackle that?
Carefully. And it is on a case-by-case basis. So that's one of the ongoing challenges of crisis communications is, while you will have similarities, each situation is different. But there are still some guidelines that you need to follow in each one. So when dealing with litigation, the best practice is to not address the litigation specifically in your response. Do not try the case in the press. However, you can directly and succinctly state the company's stance in terms of the issue overall. So that's one example, one way. If it's involving an accident where there are injuries or fatalities, you can talk about what you do, as opposed to the issue, the accident itself. In that case, you probably, and we would know as crisis practitioners, we don't have all the information. No. So we're not in a position to give a full statement. That is to the investigating authorities, whether it's fire, or police, or other law enforcement authority. They're the ones doing the investigation. So say what we can say with empathy for the people who are involved, and then refer back to the authorities who are doing the investigation, who can talk about it with authority, and let them do what they need to do. And that way, the audiences can understand that you do care, but that you can't share everything. And that's that transparency. And to the second bullet, you don't have to be right. It's okay to say, I don't know.
Yes. Okay. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Jan again.
Yes. Okay. So this is a part that neither myself or Matt or the expert for this part, right? Because in this section, Matt chiming here, that we drafted 2 of the top scholars in the US who study metaverse and AI and AR and VR. So this is a summary. Our takeaway is that metaverse is So the digital and real world are constantly interconnected. We cannot sever your real world presence or your virtual world presence, what you do there, your behavior there, totally offline. There's no separation. And also what we experience in the virtual world can continue into the real world. And the data of our actions in the physical world can definitely impact the digital world. There's no such thing as absolute privacy anymore. So the session, Matt, you remember, was really scary, right? So, and here is that summarize the technologies such as metaverse and AI, VR, AR, they are so deeply woven and interconnected that it is potentially very dangerous. And also the challenging for all of us is, at least in the US, is a lack of regulation. Right, so like, how do we regulate the data as being used, protected for privacy purposes versus commercial purposes? So it's really a wild wide west in, at least in the US space here. And I like this quote from our speakers that all the bad things that human beings are possibly able to do, they are doing it already in the virtual world. So a crisis can occur in that sense in the virtual world and in the real world, interconnected. So Matt, any high level additional thoughts, observation from your notes?
Yeah, this one was, I learned a lot in this session because, you know, we as a company, you know, one of the first things to think about is you want to secure the rights, the company's rights or the institution's rights within the metaverse or within these alternate universes from a defensive standpoint. So you need to protect your brand in these areas before somebody else gets them, and you have to try to go and do the work. The other part with that is, even if something is somebody, even if it's a very small population, if your brand is being misused in the metaverse, you still need to do your part as an organization, as communicators, working with legal to make sure that you're protected in these areas. The bigger picture that Jan was talking about is, and we see this especially in the US because, you know, in Europe with GDPR, you've got an extra layer of protection than we do here. But because we are so dependent on the technology that we get through our phones, and when you agree to the terms and conditions, you are agreeing to share your information, and everything is interwoven. Maps, credit cards, and banking, tickets to movies or theme parks, everything is interwoven. Ordering food online or making reservations at a restaurant, it is all woven together. And the legal protections for the consumer, especially in the US, you're waiving them as you're agreeing to the terms and conditions that they can get in and use your data, use your information, your digital fingerprint. The flip side of that is if you want the use of those services, if you want the benefit of all of those, you have to give it up so they can use it. And so that was a real eye-opener for us in terms of what to anticipate and how things, the potential exposure that we all have when doing this. And companies are not much different, especially when you look at things such as AI and what companies are now starting to recognize and do is making sure that their employees are not using AI. So ChatGPT, for example, or the other AI programs like that one. If you feed company information into an artificial intelligence platform for them to use it, you're giving that platform your intellectual property. You're giving them. If you're putting trade secrets in or sensitive company information, you're sharing that with an outside source, unless there are provisions that have already been put in place by your company's information security protocols. So that's something that, as especially staff members start using these platforms, we need to think about.
Okay, this is really a warning from you to be crisis prepared or crisis ready in the metaverse. Yeah. I'm looking at the time. Jan, maybe we can go on with the fourth and last slide.
Sure.
With of your framework.
Yes, time is of essence, right? So now
Yeah.
time. Thanks to Walter, a lot of discussions points has already been shared with him earlier. So we regard time as a precious resource. It's an asset and a liability in crisis communication. We also talk about emotions can amplify memory. So one of the things I want to mention is that as we know what happened in the past, if we bring out the memory, if we send a reminder, if we share a story, that emotions we experience can be activated. We can relive that experience. So that's why that when the corporate crisis happened 10 years ago, when the repeat crisis happened again, stakeholders or activist group can easily share the previous memory and evoke even worse emotions among concerned groups and publics, right? So keep in mind that anger, sadness, anxiety, all these negative emotions are powerful, that they can be reactivated, especially given the power of technology. And memorial narratives, memorial works can be powerful in rebuild community, especially after disaster. So use that for the best interest of your community. And also time is really subjective. It can be slowing down or speed up, depending on who we are talking to. For instance, for us as a crisis practitioner, the way we look at the time issue, the way we experience the time might be different from our CEO. You might be very calm, but your CEO is very like, do it now. Meanwhile, your stakeholders or victims, they are in the process of suffering. The time can feel like so long. It takes like forever, right? So be mindful that time is experience very subjective. How do we synchronize? Can that be synchronized? It's something for us to keep in mind in our crisis communication and recovery strategies and tactics. So, and I also like the fact that, for real crisis, which means not just a challenging situation, for real crisis, especially sticky crisis, whatever that happens, no matter you have a successful recovery or not, when there's a real crisis, your organization before and after a crisis will never be the same. So in other words, really to manage a crisis is to manage change, inevitable changes. Okay, and keep in mind that real crisis will take the time that they take. So quickly, Matt, any time intangible related key points to take from us?
Yeah, I think this goes back to some of the things we've already talked about in terms of how you engage with the different audiences that they will remember in many cases, but the question is, what will they remember? Mm-hmm. They will remember how they feel or how they think about a situation more so than the details of what actually happened months and years down the road. So what are you leaving with them with that they will remember over the course of the years? What are you leaving with them in that moment that they can continue to hear over time, whether it's a crisis situation or if it's a proactive situation, you're consciously reaching out to them for other reasons. And then so that long term, you're still building that bank of goodwill over time.
Yeah, and those are our key takeaways that really kind of hot from the press from our group to share with our colleagues and friends in the Netherlands. So now let's have a discussion in the remaining time we have.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at the chat, but what is interesting, you don't have all the answers. You have also very interesting questions, which makes us think, oh, how do we have these answers? Well, I don't know, but do we recognize the situations which are what we just heard? Is there somebody in the audience who has experience with a crisis in the metaverse, for example? No. A little bit silence. I don't see any questions. It's a little bit silent. What would you like to know from our practitioners in the Netherlands?
I'm curious, what are you seeing more of? So, through the pandemic and even coming out of the pandemic, we've seen an increase in cyber attacks and an emphasis on cybersecurity. But beyond that, life has gotten back more so to pre-pandemic levels with that exception. What else? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that in the Netherlands there are really a lot of cyber attacks, universities, hospitals, but all kind of companies they have them. It's quite an issue. I myself don't have any experience with it, but maybe somebody in the audience. I didn't hear not, but. Well, I know we have an institute in the Netherlands which is warning everybody to take measures, etc. So there is something going on, but I myself I can't tell a lot about that. There's a question from Marion. Jan, can you share a big crisis that you yourself learned a lot from?
Wow, that's an excellent question, right? So there are, let's see, so big crises we learn from. Well, I would say no brainer. I think COVID has been a major sticky crisis for almost like 3 years, and really kind of opened our eyes on the importance of crisis communication. Right? Because before COVID, Matt chiming here as well, we tend to look at crisis as organizational, was something challenging in one organization, but then COVID opened up our eyes to see, wow, something so sticky can really kind of shape the way we look at communication, strategic communication, almost like it's no longer whether a crisis communication should be managed by communication department or marketing department, financial, and so almost like CCO, CMO, CFO, and CEO has to really to make those decisions together. So that's tied back to earlier discussion about this readiness, right? So when it comes to dealing with sticky crises like COVID, like geopolitical challenges, recession, polarization, so that takes a group in a constant crisis mode. Doesn't mean you are constantly responding, but you are constantly monitoring, listening, prepare, surveillance, making sure that all those issues in different layers, as Matt mentioned earlier, local, national, globally, so you have a team that's ready to be maneuvered in the right place and the right time. So I would say for me, as a crisis comm scholar and practitioner, I think COVID-19 as a big, mega, or extreme or sticky crisis really can change the way how we practice, how we think about, how do we conceptualize the architecture of crisis management. So on that note, I will argue that in the past, we keep talking about crisis communication, but then it's really crisis management aiming at readiness, right? Because response, the communication element is only part of the management process. How do we work with risk management? How do we work with legal? How do we work with finance? So all these are fundamental pieces to shaping a more robust, healthier, and more resilient crisis management model in the future that can be applied globally.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. There's some remarks from, but I'm also looking at the time. It is 2 minutes to 5. There's a question to Wouter. He was involved in the crisis on St. Martin. Is it possible that we can go on a few minutes more, because it is really an interesting question. Wouter, can you tell something about this crisis on St. Martin?
No, but I'll answer it briefly then, because
yes,
of
okay.
time. No, well, in fact, I was involved at St. Martin after Hurricane Irma, but in the aftermath. So not directly after the hurricane, but more in training sessions and consultancy to improve their crisis management structures, let's say about 6 months afterwards. So not directly in the crisis itself. But what you notice is that, of course, well, the cultural aspect, that anything we're so used to use in times of crisis in the Dutch context, it's slightly different in St. Martin, even though it's part of the same kingdom, but the way authority works in terms of communication, all those kind of cultural things, you really have to tweak the communication. And I guess that Matt will recognize that from a global company perspective that will be completely different when you have a crisis in the US, what you're used to, compared to when there's a crisis in Africa or Asia.
Yeah, he was telling something here about a company standpoint, but address it locally. Yeah. Paula, she asked, I see a lot of companies I work for are dealing with preparations for crisis of digital leaks and so on. And it's look like that this is the first time finance, communication and government departments are working together. It's a good idea to take the metaphors into account. Is there a certain model, now comes the question, to make the metaphors part of the existing questions? Is there already a kind of model? Jan and Matt, is there already a model?
So I'll jump in on this one first. So I don't know that there is an existing model. I think with the metaverse, you have to remember that it will often include marketing as they've looked to ways to push the brand out through the metaverse, as ways to engage with customers. In some cases, they might have sales involved, but is that sales and marketing channel that so many companies have? Whereas in so many other crisis situations, we're not necessarily engaging with marketing because we're dealing with operations and legal and human resources and other elements. So, and same with cybersecurity incidents. If there is a data breach, whether with a company or with the vendor, that's typically not including marketing unless it's reaching customers. So I think that's more the closest that we have is if your customer information has been breached, what is your protocol for that? And then that would more to the metaverse, because if you're there to interact with customers, that's the closer channel. But I think overall, there's still some work that needs to be done because it is so new.
Yeah, that can be the conclusion. There's a lot of work to be done. Christian, I would like to give the floor to you for a summary and also a reflection of what we heard all. This will take about a few minutes and then we'll finish this lecture. But Christian, where are you?
Here I am.
Yes, okay, here you are.
All right, so thank you. I'm always very happy to be able to close off these webinars. And today, actually, I saw a question in the chat that I thought would be kind of leading for my reflection and summary at the end. Because one of the people in the chat asked the question, when we look at these experiences that Jan and Matt talked from the US perspective, how do they translate to other countries? But when I listened to you guys talk, I was very much reminded about various things that we did within Logeion. So I would like to take this opportunity to kind of point out some of the similarities that we have experienced from the Dutch context in reflection to the US experience that we just heard about. And the first one is actually in the way how the think tank was built, because like the goal of the think tank is to bring together academics and practitioners to together talk about pressing problems, in this case related to crisis communication, and to be able to together develop these theory and evidence-based resources. And to me, this very much aligns to the Center for Strategic Communication that we have within Logeion, so the CSC, of which this webinar is a part, where we also very much like to bring people from academia and from practice together to share these experiences, to see how we can learn from each other. And when we looked at like your annual a day when people come together to talk about pressing things, I was very much reminded of the way how within Logeion the so-called communication trends are developed. So within Logeion, there's a team called the trend team, and every 2 years, so not every year, but every 2 years, basically they come together and talk to all members of Logeion, and also they extend that, they go beyond Logeion to talk about what do you guys see as the pressing issues and topics for Dutch communication practitioners to focus on in the coming 2 years. And last year, so last June, we had our annual conference called C-Day, and on C-Day the trends for 22-23 were presented. I very much saw these trends reflected within everything that you guys talked about. So I'll just mention the trends and how I think they reflect to the topics that you guys work on. The first one is called that communication practitioners should be a guide in a limitless playing field. So that very much talks about the fact that we kind of see that the stakeholder groups are more expanding, and the question is, where should you respond to? There's always something to talk to. And that very much reminded me about this topic of sticky crisis that you guys talked about. So I feel here we really see some similarities between the perspectives. The second one was called technology as a new language, which means that as communication practitioners, we should not only be aware of the fact that new technologies exist, but we should also be able to speak and understand them at a level to kind of see how to deal with it. That very much reminded me of the way how Matt talked about the metaverse, that we should not only be aware of the possibilities, but also of the potential pitfalls that can occur if we were to use them in a way that doesn't work as well. The third trend is called a trust through radical transparency. And we also saw this reflected very much when Matt said we have to be transparent as much as possible. And also Dutch practitioners think the same way. So if it's possible, try to be as open as possible about the things that you talk about. And finally, the fourth trend.
No, I'm looking, sorry.
Finally, the fourth trend is that it's always important to put a moral compass at the center of everything we do. And we should be open to ask questions and also to allow for alternative perspectives. And I very much saw this reflected, for example, when Jan talked about this idea to fight this tyranny of being right, but rather instead of that, try to engage in participation and try to engage in conversations with other people also when they disagree with the perspective that we take. So what very much struck me, what I very much liked also about this webinar, that on the one hand, of course, we saw some cases that in the US may be very different from the Dutch context, but when you look at this on a slightly more abstract level, like what are the kinds of topics and challenges that we saw reflected in both cases, I saw a lot of synergy about the topics that US academics and practitioners deal with when I compare them to what Dutch academic and practitioners deal with. So I felt, there was this really nice way to see how both these contexts are different, but also how they are very much similar.
Oh, Celia,
Muted. Yeah, there was somebody coming in here, so I had to close the door. I'm sorry. Well, thank you, especially our speakers, Wouter, Matt, and Jan, for your great insights, which we will think long about. And Christian, thanks for the reflection and the participants on this meeting. You will get the presentation and also a link to the webinar to when you want to hear some parts again. There will certainly some things follow because of the collaboration between the University of Amsterdam and Georgia. We don't know exactly what, but thank you, everybody, and hope to see you again.